Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give it a minute or so to let people join us, and then we will get started. Welcome. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the White Too Long Book Talk with Robert P. Jones and Reverend Dr. Robert Franklin. My name is Allison Bantimba, and I'm the campaign manager at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Today is our first program in our Interfaith Response to White Supremacy series. The center is honored to be working in collaboration with religious and civic leaders across Atlanta to build a civic architecture that opposes white supremacist hate and violence. We will be hosting monthly virtual programs to build our collective understanding of the impact of white supremacy through our campaign for equal dignity. Before we get started, I would like to share with you a few upcoming equal dignity programs that you don't want to miss. Next Wednesday, September 9th at 7 p.m., we will be hosting a film panel for John Lewis' Good Trouble. Find the link to register and stream the documentary that honors the late Congressman's life at our website, equaldignity.org. Inspiring Justice, Artists Take Action will be on September 18th at 12 p.m. The next Equitable Dinners Lift Every Voice on voting and race equity will be on September 20th at 5 p.m. And the next Interfaith Response to White Supremacy program, What Are Truth Commissions, will be on October 2nd at 12 p.m. You can learn more about all the upcoming programs at equaldignity.org/upcoming-programs. So before we get started, all comments of the moderators and guests of our program today represent the thoughts of each individual and do not represent an official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. All right, well, I'm excited to introduce Reverend Dr. Robert M. Franklin, Jr. He will be our moderator for today's conversation. Reverend Franklin is the inaugural James T. and Berta R. Laney Chair in Moral Leadership at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. He is President Emeritus and Distinguished Professor of Morehouse College and also serves as the Senior Advisor to the Emory University President. We are especially lucky to have him with us here as Reverend Franklin is in the midst of a campaign to represent Georgia's 5th District for the remainder of the late John Lewis's unexpired term. And I would also like to welcome Robert P. Jones. He is the founder and CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute and award-winning author of the End of White Christian America, and the book he is here He has joined us here today to discuss White Too Long, the Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. If you have not already read the book, I will share a link to purchase in the chat. And if you have received your book and you would like to receive a signed nameplate by Robert P. Jones, you can email a copy of your proof of purchase of White Too Long and your mailing address to the email I will also share in the chat with the subject line White Too Long. We're all very excited to have you both here. So I want to welcome Robbie and Robert.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
My understanding, Robbie, is that you were going to get us started by providing some overview of this important book, this timely book, and then we'll engage in a little conversation. I'll pose a few questions, and then we'll receive questions from the audience. So the floor is all yours.
Oh, great. Well, Dr. Franklin, I'm so thrilled to be here with you, and want to thank you for, yes, taking time out during what I know is a really busy time, but glad, for those who don't know, we crossed paths at Emory University when I was there at Emory, and if every chance I get to be in conversation, I'm really grateful for. So thank you. So I'll say just a few words to get us started here about the book, White Too Long. And the first thing to say is, in my day job as a social scientist, I spend a lot of time looking at public opinion data and looking in particular at the attitudes of religious Americans on a whole range of issues. And so under the hood, this book has one piece of the book is that it has really a snapshot of where we are as a country and where we are particularly as people of faith and religious Americans on this issue of racial justice. The other piece of the book is this is the first book I've written that's actually part memoir. So it is a personal take. The first sentence in the book has the word I in it, and the last sentence in the book has the word us in it. So as someone who grew up as a Southern Baptist, mostly in Jackson, Mississippi, lived in the South my whole life, and whose family goes back 6 generations in Middle Georgia. So in Macon, Georgia, both sides of my family are from there. And in fact, I'm the first generation not to live there, all the way back in the 1700s. So a deep, roots in the red clay of Middle Georgia in my family, and try to kind of locate myself as a white Christian with that history in the book. And then the other piece is I think kind of really trying to reread Christian history in a way that I think has an eye toward where white supremacy, was supported, embedded, and became really lodged in the DNA of white Christianity in the country, and trying to tell as true a story as I can about that legacy that has really been suppressed and repressed, to say it. So, I'll jump to just a couple of findings in the book that I think will set the stage pretty well for the conversation. So, the first thing to say, I guess, is on the personal front, is because I think it goes to the power of white supremacy inside of American Christianity. That so I grew up, again, as a Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi, and I was that kid who was at church like 5 days a week. I mean, I was there every time the church door opened, all the way through my adolescence and the youth group. I went to a Southern Baptist college. I have a Master of Divinity degree from a Southern Baptist seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. And yet it was not until I was in my 20s in seminary that I knew or even learned about the white supremacist genesis story of my own denomination, right? And that is that the Southern Baptist Convention, that word Southern is there because it was actually a secessionist movement, a split between Northern and Southern Baptists, and it was explicitly over the issue of slavery, right? And specifically whether someone who was clergy, specifically a missionary, could legitimately own slaves or not. And the Northern Baptists disagree with that. Baptists in the South essentially took their ball and went home, formed their own denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, in 1845. And then, this was no fringe movement. I mean, by the middle of the 20th century, this denomination with this history had become the largest representation of white Christian churches in the country, the largest Protestant denomination in the country, with more than 16 million members in its heyday. But yet this understanding of the kind of origins of the denomination just wasn't there. And so I think when I first learned that, I mean, it was sort of shocking to me, but it's kind of sat back there in my adult life. And only in the last 5 years, really, have I made it a part of my scholarship and really tried to work on it, and resulting in this book. But I'll jump to the kind of public opinion data too, to say, like, this is not just something way back there in the past. So it'd be one thing if it's back there and we've had some process of moving away from it. But the current public opinion data, I think, shows just how much this is still with us today. And I'll just take one example. The book develops this out more thoroughly, but just to take one example ripped from the headlines today, we asked a question for a number of years at PRRI in national surveys about perceptions of the killing of African-American men by police. And what we found is this massive gap among white Americans between those who identify as Christian and those who do not. And it's basically, I think, in the opposite direction than most white Christians would expect it to be if you ask them on this question. If you ask who's closer to the views of African Americans, is it white Christians or whites who are not Christian? Most white Christians, I think, would like to think that they're more in solidarity with their African American brothers and sisters. But what we find is on this question and on many others, this pattern. That white Christians of all kinds are about twice as likely as whites who are not Christian to say that killing of African-American men by police are just isolated incidents rather than part of a pattern of how police treat African-Americans. This pattern stands up on questions around Confederate monuments and flags, around the criminal justice system and unequal treatment of African-Americans, around economic mobility, with whites really across the board. What it really boils down to is that whites who identify as Christian have very difficult time seeing systemic racism in the country, and that this exists at the same time that they report having warm feelings toward African Americans. So we have this kind of like paradoxical findings that at a personal level, white Christians, say they felt very warmly toward African Americans, but when we ask about anything around systemic racism, there is in effect this moral blind spot. The last thing I'll say, and we'll just jump into where we want to go, but it's notable. I think one of the more surprising findings in the public opinion data is that these patterns are not just there among white evangelicals in the South, right? And many may not be that surprised if they were those patterns existed among white evangelicals in the South, with kind of a history of resisting, supporting segregation, supporting Jim Crow, supporting slavery. That legacy is still there. But the remarkable thing in the book that I found is that these attitudes are largely still alive also among white mainline Protestants. That is, those who are really more prevalent in the upper Midwest. They're also fairly prevalent among white Catholics in the country who have their own history of discrimination and anti-Catholic sentiment in the country. And yet these attitudes basically this link between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as white and Christian stand up among all of the white Christian subgroups in the country, no matter what region they're from or from what denominational family they're from. So those are the basic kind of contours of the books and kind of the central findings, but I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Franklin, and we can see where we want to go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robert Jones. We call him Robbie.
Robbie's good, yeah.
We do have history in terms of Emory University connections. A couple of years ago, the program, Laney Program in Moral Leadership at Candler School of Theology invited you to come and deliver one of our keynote lectures on a series of faith and politics. And it was a stunning moment because at that time you were highlighting findings from your book, The End of White Christian America. So think about that title, The End of White Christian America. And then this book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And I'd say you have a knack for provocative book titles. And I'm just curious about the response from Southern Baptist family and friends to this really quite compelling autobiographical, as you say, part memoir, part report on the state of racism and openness to reckoning with that racism in the churches today.
Yeah.
Responses you get.
Well, I'd say that I guess the biggest pushback response I've gotten is about the words white supremacy. And because I think what happens is when many white Christians hear that word, that term, they initially think, well, that has nothing to do with me, right? We think about that as the KKK and people in sheets and burning crosses and lynching people. And I think many mainstream white Christians think, well, that's both in the past and out there, right? Not in here. And so one of the things I talked about in the book is it's really about my own journey on this as well, as of understanding this term. And one of the things we could do is we just flip the words around. Instead of talking about white supremacy, talk about the supremacy of whites, and think about what that really means. It means really supporting a society that is set up to benefit and value the lives of whites more than the lives of other Americans. And I think there's no honest reading of American history that you can come up with that doesn't that's basically been the journey of America, is moving gradually away from that assumption. It starts with way in the, back in the early days of the Republic, it was only land-owning white men, right, that were enfranchised. And that we've gradually expanded that notion, but all the way up through the 20th century with zoning codes and restrictive neighborhood covenants and who could get loans for college, who could get loans for mortgages. all of these laws have been about privileging the lives of whites and making it more difficult, I think, for the lives of others. And even the very idea of like manifest destiny and pioneering and settlement and the way we think about American history is deeply, deeply shot through with this idea that whites were entitled, right, to these lands, that whites were entitled to settle, these lands, and that they were divinely entitled to settle these lands, and that it was really God's plan for society for whites to quote unquote civilize the rest of the world. I mean, this is a deeply, in the colonialist project and in the settlement of this country, and that white Christians in particular have been the chief legitimizers, the most powerful legitimizers of that way of thinking, and of kind of legitimizing things. So I think trying to unpack that term and to get a better understanding of that and to make it closer to us than is comfortable, I think, for many white Christians, I think is part of what I'm up to in the book. But it's not that hard to get there once you tell a kind of a more straightforward and honest history.
Yeah. As you opened, you noted the history of the Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest, after Catholicism, America's largest Protestant denomination. And I think people should be aware of the fact that during that period of the pre-Civil War, antebellum period, 1840s, not only the Southern Baptists split, but Methodists also split on questions of slavery and successionism, as did Presbyterians. So we have a lot of sort of Southern Methodist, Southern Presbyterian, and Southern Baptist cultures that emerged at the time. I think the other interesting fact, as we try to sort of get our brains around how did Christianity in America evolve, is that there emerged independent African-American congregations during that same period. And there were regional churches, but by 1895, national denominations with the African Methodist Episcopal National Baptist Convention. And I think that move toward a national presence represented a desire for a certain amount of political power in the world. And I wonder if you could say a word about, speaking of religious denominations that have political power and the dominance of the Southern Baptist culture on other mainline. I wonder if you could reflect on that. How powerful are Southern Baptists still today? And because we're going to need change in that denomination, among others, in order to move forward. And we can get to that. How, what are the levers for change? But just help us understand how powerful and significant that tradition is.
Yeah. Well, it's been, like, as I said, by the time you get to the middle of the 20th century, I mean, it becomes the dominant expression of white Protestantism in the country, right? It's been very much connected to the rise of the Christian right in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s movement. So at the same time, like within the Southern Baptist world, at the same time that there was a kind of takeover of the convention and a kind of move even further to the right, that was very much wrapped up with this political movement. And so what's happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the rise of the Christian right, a kind of politicization even of the Southern Baptist Convention to be a little more part of that movement. A purge of the seminaries was one of the things that happened, with a lot of professors getting fired. I was actually part of that, caught the tail end of that when I was at Southwestern Seminary, even as late as the 90s. That kind of house cleaning was going on in order to kind of more politically align the denomination with the Republican Party and with that movement. But I'll say that one big thing to kind of remember here is that was part of a much bigger white flight from one political party to the other. I think it's really worth noting today that that white Christianity and issues of white supremacy are absolutely wrapped up in the composition of the two political parties we have today. So, PRRI is a nonpartisan, organization. I know this is a nonpartisan conversation, but if we're going to honestly look at our history, the composition of the two parties today, with the Republican Party that is now nearly 7 in 10 white and Christian, and a Democratic Party that's only about a third white and Christian. How do we get there? Well, we get there from two very different reactions by predominantly white Christians to the civil rights movement, right? Prior to the civil rights movement, we have we would call prior to 1965 the solid Democratic South. Right now we have the solid Republican South, and that really is from white Christians switching parties. Why did they switch parties? It wasn't abortion. It wasn't same-sex marriage. It was reactions to the civil rights movement that was the original fuel and propulsion that kind of creates these vectors that have resulted in the two parties that we have today. And I will say that this is not just a Southern Baptist problem. Again, I want to make sure I say that over and over. As you're right, the Methodist split, right, and didn't come back together in the 30s. And even when they did, they segregated the African American churches into one, this kind of fictional central jurisdiction as a way. It was basically a religious gerrymandering project, right, to kind of reduce their power inside the denomination. The Presbyterians don't come back together until the 1980s. I mean, it takes more than a century for that to come back. So it's not, again, not just the kind of evangelical world, but the mainline world as well, and the Catholic world, which we can talk about later if we want, but as well. One thing I'll say that's hopeful on this front is that we are seeing inside the Southern Baptist Convention is my home state of Mississippi, just as most of you are aware, just finally voted to take the Confederate battle flag out of its state flag. And what one hopeful sign I thought is that the Mississippi Baptist Convention, and in fact, a former seminary classmate of mine, who's the president of the seminary, president of the Mississippi Baptist Convention, actually called on the governor and the legislature to take that action. Now that's quite remarkable. That's the official state arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. So for a convention that has that history, for the Mississippi, state contingency to make that claim, I think does tell us that we're at a different moment.
I looked at the bibliography of your important book, and it was interesting to me. I'm always curious about, which texts and conversation partners informed your work. I was pleased to see, Du Bois is there, and James Baldwin is there. The all-important Ida B. Wells is there, as she documented racialized and racist violence against Black bodies. And then there were some texts I didn't see. I expected to see, like James Cone and some more contemporary voices. But that aside, James Cone sort of really made a reputation in the world by saying that it is not possible to be Christian and racist. And he gets a lot of cold shoulders from mixed audiences, white Christian audiences, even some so-called Negro churches felt that was a bit harsh and strong. But that's a reality that Black churches pushed back against much of what you're describing. And I wonder if what you found emerging in that dialogue or in that argument between Black and white churches in their competing claims about what Christianity means in the world and how it should translate into race relations.
Yeah. Well, Cone certainly, under the hood there, particularly the cross and the lynching tree was something that, was sort of in my head as I was writing. It's interesting, that quote, I think it cuts a couple of different ways, right? I mean, but I think one of the things I'm wanting to say in this book is I think it's too easy for many white Christians to separate a kind of idealized version of Christianity that remains free of racism and free of entanglement with white supremacy in some theoretical way, and the actual lived version of Christianity that we see on the ground in American history. And one line I have in the book is I say, look, if we're honest about it, we have to be able to say things like this, like the light-skinned Jesus that most white churches conjured throughout most of American history was not only just fine with slavery and segregation and Jim Crow, he actually demanded it as part of what it meant to be Christian, right? That was a way that so many of my ancestors understood was authentic Christianity, right? And I want to take that seriously. And so, because I think only by taking that seriously can we really begin to reckon with how it's been built into our present, right? If we somehow dismiss it as, oh, well, there's real idealized Christianity that's remained pristine and untouched over here, and then, we got mixed up and got complicit. I think it doesn't really put us in a good position to take seriously how much over centuries of time that white supremacy has actually been built into the DNA of white Christianity. And you'll see these differences, right? There's maybe no more difference as distilled, like the themes you'll hear from Cone, and even from Baldwin, are, I mean, you hear the Exodus, right? You hear liberation, you hear Amos, you hear Isaiah, you hear, those kind of ringing tones from King, kind of citing the prophets. You hear a lot less of that from white Christian churches. You know, you hear a lot more Paul, a lot more obedience, a lot more hierarchy. And I think that's by design. And then I think the other just quick thing I'll point to that I think is a challenge for white Christians and is the way in which white Christians have made the beginning and the end of religion being about a highly individualized personal relationship with Jesus, right? That is really a kind of interiorized psychological and maybe emotional connection. But what that does is when that becomes the sum total of what it means to be religious, is that it screens out these calls for screens out even seeing injustice. It screens out calls to step up for justice. And I think about this, line from Letter from Birmingham Jail, where King was like asking in dismay, like, well, who are all these good-hearted mainstream Christians and where are they, right, in the middle of all of this? And he has this line where he says, what are they doing? Like, they're sitting safely behind the anesthetizing stained glass windows. And I think that has become so clear to me that has been one function I think that white Christian theology has done, is it has actually created either a blind spot or a kind of lulled our consciences to sleep in a way where we can be just fine in Jesus, right? At the same time, we are deaf and indifferent to injustice all around us.
Yeah, thank you for that. You, by the way, there's a spirited conversation going on in our chat, and I'm going to draw on a couple of questions in a moment. But you use a word, I'm glad you did before I brought it up, reckoning. This is a moment of reckoning in American society. Of course, George Floyd, and on the same day, back in May 25th, the Amy Cooper, Christian Cooper exchange, I think kind of riveted and focused the nation in a new way on the homework we need to do to understand American history. And as Maya Angelou said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And I think this is the invitation of this moment, to face our history with courage. And part of the power of your book and in the previous book is that personal, individual voice, the testimonial side, part memoir, of telling your family stories. Even like page 2 or 3, I mean, there's this phrase that I hold on to, that I looked at the Bible in my household, the family Bible from 1815, and it was a record in the genealogy of Baptist preachers, slave owners, and Confederate soldiers. And I had to put the book down and just sort of reflect on that image, that this was a part of your family. Yeah. And it made me admire your courage in stepping forth and speaking truth to your own reality. So let's talk about this reckoning that's going on now, though, because my sense and some of the data has suggested that many white Americans began began a journey toward greater understanding, reckoning. People were reading Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, is one of the more important texts. People were reading Ibram Kendi's important work on Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist. Many in the religious community, we were directing them to your books, and people like Tim Wise and Jim Wallace and other, I think, courageous white moral voices on issues of race and racism. But I'm just wondering if in this sort of charged political season, if there are, let's say, although we are a nonpartisan program, let's imagine that there are previous supporters of President Trump who are Christian and who feel uneasy, have an uneasy conscience and want to walk away. So they were never Trumpers, but they're becoming no longer Trumpers. And they encounter your text. I'm just wondering what's the guidance you offer to white Christians who want to get this right, this moment of reckoning. They want to be whole and healed and cleansed and open to forgiveness and reconciliation with people of color.
Yeah.
Sorry for that long question.
No, I hear you. I mean, one of the things that I'll just start with is one of the things I'm hearing when I'm in conversation with other African Americans or particularly clergy or others. I think given the rhetoric, particularly that President Trump has stepped up, for example, around law and order, right? I mean, this is a very old trope, right? That kind of goes back to George Wallace. And the Southern strategy used by Republicans. I mean, again, this is just historically very, very clear. This is a kind of a part of the Southern strategy, which, by the way, I should say that the Republican Party and the Southern strategy was a kind of exploitation of white racial fears, right, to kind of drive votes on the Republican side of politics. And it's something that the Republican Party itself admitted it had done, repudiated, and apologized for in 2005. Right, so it is clearly a kind of acknowledged, part of our history, but it's back. I mean, I think there's just no way to say it. It's back, and one of the things I'm hearing, from people of color in my circles is to say, look, it may have been that there was a more complex, picture in 2016 around kind of electoral choices, but the one thing I'm hearing is to say, like, whatever other reasons. Are you saying then that being kind of supporting these kinds of racist tropes is not a deal breaker, for you at the end of the day? And I think that more than ever, this moment has us. It's not just in our politics, but it's in how we're reforming our police departments. It's how we're thinking about the criminal justice code, and how we're thinking about monuments. Right, we're in Atlanta here, right, all over the South. There are still over 1,000 Confederate monuments, still standing on public lands, across the country and heavily across the South. So I think we're at this moment where, yes, it is a moment of reckoning. I honestly see this. I'm 52. I was born in '68, but I don't remember, right, the Civil Rights Movement. But in my 52 years, I can certainly say I have never seen a moment like this one. I mean, it is the civil rights moment of our time. And I think the other thing to say is, I think many white Christians, when we think back to the civil rights movement, we like to think we would have been on the right side of history when we kind of project ourselves back in a kind of idealized way of understanding the civil rights movement, forgetting how messy it was, right, for those who actually participated. And, one question I kind of put to my fellow white Christians is, if we think that's right, this is a civil rights moment of our time. What we do now is what we would have done then.
Yeah. Well said. One other interesting movement that emerged among white evangelicals in recent years, I wonder if you know about the Urbana 15 or 2015, when it's kind of an intervarsity press gathering in Urbana, Illinois, thousands of young evangelical Christians, and one powerful voice, I think, was an African-American woman, Michelle Higgins, sort of presented up Black Lives Matter as a part of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And many people were surprised that so many of the younger white evangelical Christians at Urbana 2015 affirmed it and were ready to say, yes, she's right. That's what the gospel calls for. Many were not very unhappy with being confronted that way. And it led to a lot of discussion, and I haven't followed all of it, but I just wanted to note, again, these interesting moments of reckoning have been almost incremental. A series of them, I think, came to the head this summer.
I think one thing that became clear to me in the book research was that 2015 was a real turning point, right? But I think it was much more controversial. Like, I know of a church here in Maryland that put a Black Lives Matter sign up, and it was burned 3 different times. Right? They put it back up, it was set on fire. They put it back up, set on fire. And I'm not seeing that happen now these days, right? I think we are at, it's a note that we are at a different place, I think, in this certainly in this conversation. I think it's just important to note that. But I think what we've had, right, is we had Dylan Roof murdering 9 African Americans while at church, right, in Charleston. We had that, and then in 2017, we just passed the 3-year anniversary just a few weeks ago of the march in Charlottesville of white supremacists overtly defending a statue of Robert E. Lee while chanting "Jews will not replace us" and neo-Nazi slogans like "blood and soil." And honestly, I think those were some of the things that actually spurred me along in writing this book, and I think have really shifted, I think, Americans' responses on this. But I mean, I kind of come back to so I think that's right. But I think these deeper attitudes around structural racism is really where the battle is. You see an outright denial by President Trump and Vice President Pence, both explicitly denying the existence of a systemic racism in the country. And so it's actually now right along our political dividing lines. Both Biden and Harris mentioned systemic racism, right? So we had back-to-back conventions, one holding it up as the vital issue of our time, one denying its existence. And again, they're kind of now along partisan lines, which makes this very, very difficult, I think, to have a rational conversation when you get the kind of partisan defensiveness kicking up as soon as the conversation tries to get off the ground.
A lot of questions are emerging in our Q&A and chat about practical steps that local congregations, local believers, friends of believers can take to sort of move the needle toward justice and deconstructing white supremacy. And one colleague described how her congregation removed the sort of Euro Jesus, blonde, blue-eyed, from, there was a painting that they removed. This was happening in many Black churches, 20 years ago, but in many, it has not changed. And you mentioned monuments. I'm wondering about the power of symbolism. Is that a step that you recommend? I mean, I know you're a social scientist, but I'm sort of asking you about best practices, practical steps, and I wish we were all together because we could have a spirited conversation about this. Because there are leaders here who are doing courageous things that I want to commend. But what have you seen? What have you admired out there?
Yeah, well, I think the battle over I devote a whole chapter in the book to Confederate monuments. Right. Because I think they're important because symbols matter. Yes. Right. And the reason why many of these, take Decatur, Georgia, right there, the reason why many of these little county seat towns have these massive Confederate monuments on the courthouse grounds were very much to say to African Americans, don't you forget who's still in power. I mean, that was the message that they were meant to send. That's why they're on the courthouse grounds, right? And not out in some cemetery somewhere.
Robbie, are you aware they just removed that?
I am.
So I want to commend, Black and white folk and NAACP. They work together to take action. Anyhow, go on.
Yeah, no, that's the reason why I brought it up, because it's one, and also last fall, I spent 2 weeks in Richmond, walking Monument Avenue, doing research in Richmond, which is still the headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, by the way, which is the organization responsible for the vast majority of these getting put up in the early part of the 20th century. But what's remarkable, there was five massive monuments along Monument Avenue. 4 of the 5 have come down in the last weeks across this summer. The last one to Robert E. Lee is slated for removal and is involved in a kind of a court back and forth over who has the jurisdiction to actually authorize its removal. But that's something I couldn't have imagined, even when I turned in the manuscript to this book last fall. I would not have imagined these things stood for over 100 years there, and they're coming down. I think that matters to us. But I think what's really going to matter is to make sure that we don't stop at the symbols, right? Because it'd be easy to sort of take the symbols down and then think, okay, great, we're done. But I think I actually wrote an op-ed talking about this, that we have to remember that in virtually all of those monument ceremonies, there were white Christian ministers blessing those monuments as they went up. Yes. And they were there giving the invocation. They were there preaching, even sermons, and like multi-day celebrations when these things were essentially consecrated.
Yes.
right? There were Confederate flags in the Washington National Cathedral, for goodness sake, put there by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And they've now been removed as well. But I think removing the symbols is one thing, but taking seriously a kind of similar deconstruction that has to happen in our theologies and in our culture as well. Because remember that, like, the theologies that bless those things also need deconstructing, right? And I think we've hardly begun that work.
Yeah, important. Recall that Martin Luther King's last book, 1968, was titled, "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" That's a haunting question. I often pose that to my students and constituents. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And we had a question about the legacy of white supremacy. Can it really be deconstructed? Can it be? Is there hope that it could be corrected? Where do we go from here? And what can white Christians do to make a greater difference?
Yeah. All right, well, I'm going to quote Brother Baldwin here on this one. You know, he sort of famously said, look, not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Yes.
And I've become really convinced of that. I think it is an open question whether white Christians will have the will and the courage, really, to do this work. And, you know, if you think about work that's been done, it's been built over centuries. It's not going to be undone overnight. It's going to be a process, and it's probably a generational process of undoing this. But the beginning of it is just telling the truth. Yes. That is really the beginning of it. And I can give you just a quick example in my own story here is, kind of researching just my own family's history, right, and trying to tell the truth about that. The other work that I did is I did a couple. So we're in Atlanta, just down the road in Macon. You know, where both my parents are from, are two Baptist churches, one white, one predominantly white, one predominantly black, that are doing this work, and it's been a 7-year process of them doing this work together. And it has meant that they have been a very hard work, I think, for the white church in particular. So, for example, the white church found out in doing some of their own truth telling that at one point in their church's history, when they were having trouble making the church budget meet, they were in the red and haven't paid the pastor's salary. They balanced the books by selling some of their own enslaved members to balance the books of their church, and found that in the records, once they started. Now, that's not something that typically makes it into the glossy church history, that many churches put out. But I think telling these stories and having the courage to do that together is actually work that white Christians can do themselves. Right. And I guess the last point I want to make is this one, that it's also really important, I think, for we white Christians to realize that, yes, we have work to do that involves justice and repair in relationship to our African-American brothers and sisters. But even setting that aside, this is not an altruistic project, right? If we take seriously how disfigured our faith has become by this a priori commitment to the superiority of whites over others, and that was built into our theology, our liturgy, and our institutions, like, we have a self-interested, task to kind of make sure we do our part to take what we've received, purge it as much as we can, so that we're not handing this down, or handing down at least less of it to our children and our grandchildren.
Yeah. Whenever I hear Baldwin invoked, I always think about, it's a quote that I actually used in my book on moral leadership. I love from James Baldwin, that history is trapped in people and people are trapped in history. Yeah. And so the need, liberation and wholeness can only come when we reckon with that. It's fascinating that as you were talking about Macon, one of our colleagues posted from, Upper Room Heights, wrote, "I would love to hear more about ways churches can engage for healing, similar to the example of the two churches in Macon cited in the book. Where can we do the work inside the body of Christ?" So, you described that work that's being affirmed here, and I think it's a model, I think, and where we can find Black and white churches and Latinx and Asian and Native American congregations willing to come together around what Howard Thurman, the great African-American theologian, talked about, in search of common ground, then there can be breakthroughs. So, you know, as you were talking, I was also thinking about a recent testimony I heard from the daughter of George Wallace. So here's former Alabama governor, George Wallace, who really made his career, initially starting as a racial moderate, and grew more segregationist because he found that got him more votes. But here's his little daughter, 8-year-old Peggy Wallace, looking at her daughter on the stage, saying, "Segregation now, segregation forever." And she said, "As I grew up, I didn't understand my dad, what this meant. But as I grew up, I realized that was wrong." And so today, Peggy Wallace Kennedy has become a good friend of the Reverend Dr. Bernice King here in Atlanta. And they've been, you know, doing programs together. But it's an example of a prominent white family, white leader saying, "I'm going to transgress. I'm going to break away and have my own voice and stand for what's right." Yeah. I'm wondering if there are people on our scene today in the white Christian community that you see doing that, people we can celebrate and admire. I mean, I wish the people on the White House Religious Advisory Council, I wish there was more conscience and courage there, that they would say to this president, "That's wrong. Don't say that. Don't go there." There weren't good people on both sides. But I don't expect that from Pastor Paula or some of the leaders there. I don't think we'll hear much from Falwell going forward. So, but who out there is leading the communities, you know, Southern Baptists and beyond?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess a couple of things. You know, one of the things I became clear about, I think, just looking at the history, is that we're going to need a lot more of this, less from kind of brand names that we all know at the national level, and a lot more from people at the local and congregational level. We're not, you know, another statement by the National Council of Churches or the National Catholic Bishops Conference is not going to get us much of anywhere. You know, it's really clear that, I mean, those statements have been issued. They've been issued for decades, all right? And it really hasn't filtered down to much change in the pews. But, you know, one place, so, you know, inside the Southern Baptist Convention, the new president, J.D. Greer, you know, has actually taken a stand of his own about refusing to use a gavel that was given, you know, by one of the founders of the denomination, who was a slave owner, and has been used to gavel in the Southern Baptist Convention for more than 150 years, and is refusing to use it going forward. So, you know, that it's a little small symbolic step, but I think those kinds of things matters. But I think what we're going to need really is more courageous people at the local level, because really this is about relationship at the end of the day. That can't be built up here. It has to be built, you know, down on the ground. And what people need, I think, are institutional spaces to help these conversations happen. It's really difficult as even as a well-meaning individual to just decide you're going to, you know, break this stuff down. But if you've got a kind of institutional setting which churches can provide, I think that's vitally important. And I guess one other little word of caution that I think that I learned actually from watching these two courageous churches in Macon work together over, you know, a very long period of time, particularly on the white side. Reverend Scott Dickinson, you know, told me at one point, he said, "Look, I've stopped talking about reconciliation." And what he meant by that was that what happens too often is that I think white Christians want to mend the fences, but they want to mend them quickly, right? Because it's a really once you've started to admit and lament and apologize, that's a really uncomfortable place. And you know, the temptation is, I want to get out of this discomfort quickly. But I think the wisdom that I think they have found is, he said, "Look, we are trying to talk about justice and repair." And we see, like, as our side of this equation, as the white, it's kind of the predominantly white church, is to just keep the conversation focused on justice, repair, and building trust. And we're going to trust that our African-American brothers and sisters are going to tell us when we're reconciled, right? And because that comes as an outgrowth of this work for justice and repair, rather than just kind of reaching so fast. Now, aren't we good, right? Is I think the temptation.
Very important insights. individual courage at the local level. Second, institutional safe harbors where those conversations can happen. Institutional, congregational sponsorship of partnerships and of internal work. I think both those are really valuable to highlight, as you just did. It's an interesting question. I'm just curious. Jasmine Jenkins asked Dr. Jones, how has your research and responses to it shaped your own faith life?
Yeah.
So we're getting into business here.
No, it's, I mean, you know, you write some memoir and then the door's open. So yeah, I try to document this really in the book, you know. I mean, this has been a journey. You know, from that initial awakening again in my 20s, you know, 3 decades ago, of realizing kind of the history of my own denomination, to really the last 5 years in particular, as we've seen the forces of white supremacy more out in the open, not whispering, not dog whistles, they're megaphones that we're seeing today. And I think that just feeling this moment has been part of my own conscience being pricked and broadened. And I think these metaphors of, even for well-meaning white Christians, I think the things in the way are a kind of, you know, what I can only describe as kind of a naive or immature insistence on an innocent history, right? Of not willing to be able to face it. Like, if we're authentically Christian, it has to be good, right? We're good people who do good things. How can this be? But being willing to sort of have a more mature understanding that, like for me, I mean, I grew up in the church. I had a very positive experience inside the white evangelical churches I grew up in. At the same time, I realized that the things I absorbed and that were built into me limited my moral vision in extreme ways. So that these issues of racial justice were not even questions for me growing up, and to kind of realize that, and to kind of think, okay, I've got some work to do to kind of do it. But here's one basic thing I think that it was helpful for me. 2 things actually. One, I just spent some time journaling at the very beginning of this writing, and the question, and this is for, you know, other white Christians out there, that I kind of put in front of my blank page was, where does the issue of race even show up in my memory?
Yes. Right.
And that's a question only white people can really ask themselves, you know, who can be naive enough to think, oh, I don't even know, you know, but, and to kind of let the memories come and that kind of start pulling that thread. That was sort of one practical thing that was helpful, you know, for me. But here's the other thing, I think. If we think about, you know, the beloved community and trying to act out of a sense of love, and then if we just, I think if white Christians would just say this again, kind of, let's tell the truth. And 2, when we hear our African-American brothers and sisters in pain, in anguish, and angered over injustice, even if we don't quite understand it, let's sit with it and not dismiss it. Right? Let's not be so arrogant. I mean, after having gotten so much wrong right, on the issue of race through our history, let's at least have the humility to sit and listen and try to get another perspective on it, and not be so arrogant as to pretend like we know better.
I really celebrate that important word, which is both a kind of rational argument, but also a pastoral invitation. Sit with the discomfort, catch yourself, you know, manage your impulse and the arrogance involved in saying, enough of this, I don't have time for this. That's something important, I think, for us to hear. You're doing a lot of media interviews, and a friend, Tom Johnson here, asks the question, what is the role of responsible media in all of the change we're trying to imagine here?
I think really calling a spade is the first thing that comes to mind. Not using euphemisms. If something is you know, racist, we should call it racist. If it's kind of being built out of a history of white supremacy, we should call out that history. And I think there is a, you know, I think just as the media has been struggling about, I mean, even when does the media use the word lie? Right? You know, and is it untruth? Is it a lie? What's the distinction? I think the media's had to develop a whole new kind of vocabulary, I think, for our current moment. Right. But I think one incredibly important piece of this is to have us like think about like, and when we hear, I think again, I just have to say, like, when you hear things like suburban women are afraid of low-income housing invading their neighborhood, and an African-American man, Cory Booker, is going to be in charge of that. Yeah. Like that was in one 160 character tweet by the president. Yeah. So Republican or Democrat, independent, whatever. I mean, when we really break that down, right, that is Black man as threat to white women. Yes. And what is that? That is the logic of lynching. Yes. Right. That is the very logic that strung up That's right. more than 5,000 people in this country. And we can't, I think we just can't flinch when we see something like that, and whoever's saying that, but we have to be able to call that out and call it out really clearly.
I really appreciate you highlighting that. As we begin to wrap up, when you mention lynching, speaking truth about our history, I do want to observe that Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was in your bibliography, her important book, The Red Record. I hope our viewers and listeners will pay more attention to that African-American woman, feminist, womanist journalist at the end of the 19th century, who had the courage to document lynchings. And so when we fast forward to Brian Stevenson and that extraordinary project of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, and I hope you all have been to visit the so-called National Memorial or Lynching Museum. But friends here in Fulton County and in DeKalb County are working on this remembrance project to bring those kind of memorial coffins engraved with the names of victims right here in Metro Atlanta, Fulton County, thanks to Allison Bantimba and the Fulton County Remembrance Committee, and to the terrific leaders in DeKalb County working on the very same remembrance project. So that's practical work, and multiracial interfaith leaders have come together to work on that. But again, I think the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett helped to disabuse people, saying there's so much rape and violence by Black men against white women. She said, let's look at the facts, and found quite otherwise, and how this was often an excuse. Often the lynching emerged when Black workers were demanding better wages and fair wages. So this was a way of threatening the entire community by trumping up these sorts of allegations. Wow, Robbie, we're just like at a minute and a half left. I wonder if there's a closing comment you want to make. I'm hoping everyone please get the book. It's very important, very exciting at this moment in history. Let this be a part of your conversations in local congregations. But I'll give you a word, and then I'll just close with an interesting quote.
All right. Well, I'm going to give Baldwin the last word on this one. It's one that I think is hopeful. Yes. And it's this. And he again talked about the critical importance of being able to tell the truth about our history, right? And he said basically, if we can find that courage to tell the truth, and these are his words, we will end the racial nightmare. We will achieve our country, and we will change the history of the world. Now, he wrote that more than 50 years ago, but it could have been written, in an op-ed today.
Wow. Find the courage. We can change the world. And I think in many of our lifetimes, we've seen that happen. I mean, the election of Barack Obama and the changes that are needed ahead. We can act. We can make things happen. Thank you to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Thank you, Allison Bantimba, for your leadership and the team there. Thank you, Robbie Jones, for this important book. And the final word from me is a quotation by a medieval rabbi, Maimonides, who said, "The world is equally balanced between good and evil, and your next act will tip the scale." So I hope you all will be scale tippers as you go out into your afternoon and into this Labor Day weekend. Blessings on you. Let's make change happen. Thank you, Robbie, for inspiring us.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation, both of you. It was such an honor to have you both here. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Franklin. Good luck in the